So basically now it's commonly praised as a good thing. There's widely, you see international organizations, national governments, local authorities, academics, everybody talks about it, promote it, advocate it. And there's a large number of schemes that have been implemented, and everywhere you see it's talked about. So there are still concerns about it though, and that's the reason why we are here. We are talking about it still. The outline of my talk is about looking at it from those 3 points, and I explained what I mean by those odd words: multiplicity, multidimensionality, and metamorphosis. First is multidimensionality of it. And I put this cubist painting to show that you can look at it from various angles, and it is not a coherent, consistent thing. If you look at it, for example, at these examples, it's a place of leisure and conviviality, as in it's just round the clock, as in Copenhagen on top left. It's a place of community building, as this case in Brussels. Is a place of hardened boundaries between the public and private, as this case designed by in Milan and by Zaha Hadid, designed by Zaha Hadid, and is a place of exclusion and homelessness, as in this case in Paris. So it is a multiplicity of situations and dimensions to public space. Is not one thing, is not one place, is many overlapping processes with many degrees and many faces. So it is an ambiguous in-between place. It is a mirror of the urban society. And the urban society is not such a simple, one-sided thing. So as a theater of social life, we see it as is in between the built environment, the material, institutional, and that's where the issues about democracy a lot comes in, but also the organizations, laws, conventions, and the technological. Nowadays, people talk about digital space as if it's a different realm above everything else. So when people say public space, they often compound these things, integrate these, or have some reference to some of these ideas. And it's always between politics, economics, and culture. And it's between different visions of how these should be organized, between collaboration and harmony and consensus building, or a place of conflict and unequal relationships. So one thing that happens is how different people interpret it differently. I went to this event in Coventry. It's very interesting. They asked people to build with these Lego on different tables what they think, what they imagine a good public space would be like. And then at the end, they put everything on this single table. And I took a picture of it. And the interesting thing is, and they were not architects or planners, or they were coming from media studies, cultural studies, that sort of thing. And the fascinating thing is that the majority of people had a negative view of public space. They either projected the conditions of their private garden, private home onto the public environment, or they said that they found it overcrowded, unpleasant, noisy, dirty. They want to get rid of it. They want to escape from it. There was a gay man who said, anywhere I go in the public environment, I just want to escape from it, go to a place where I feel safe. So we take for granted that it's such a wonderful thing, and everybody is trying to produce it and reproduce it. But it's not taken commonly by various people. So we have also misunderstanding and rejection of it, not a commonly held thing. So what we have then is a multidimensional thing with many faces, not a single core with many faces, many things with many faces. And what we have, the problem, is that people talk about one thing and it may end up being another. They may talk about all those implications of democracy, equality, inclusivity, but in fact what they produce, what the outcome is very exclusive, very inaccessible, very unequal. So that is one of the problems of this multidimensionality. The second point is about metamorphosis. And by that I mean a lot of changes and shifts. And I show you this timeline of how the concern for public space comes about. And obviously you all know about it. There is a big shift a generation ago from the paradigm of welfare state to the paradigm of neoliberal organization of politics and economics. And that is the point where all this privatization happens, all the withdrawal of the government from production of the environment and management of the environment happens. And at that point, the concern about public space starts to be raised because privatization relocates the balance, the dividing line between them. And that is the start of the campaign for public space. So we see a whole generation of people who've been campaigning for public space, and rightly so. So it has generated this widespread response by all these organizations and people like us and the governments and at all levels. And even as you see example of London, where the London Assembly produces this public life in private hands as a leaflet. But what happens is that in this process, in this timeline, the idea becomes co-opted by the market. And that is the part of the metamorphosis of public agencies. At one point, we define public space as that which is owned and controlled by public agencies. But when public agencies themselves start behaving like private firms and thinking about the world as and the urban environment as an asset in the marketplace, then the nature of things change. The rhetoric may remain, but the nature of it changes. Now, I'll show you the examples. Up top left is Nottingham city centre, and the quotation there is from a PhD I examined about public spaces. And he had interviewed the planners in Nottingham, and they refer to this central square of the city as a private territory. We rent it out on a rental basis. And this is a public planner in a public authority talking about the public space in the middle of the city. So the mentality has changed. The other big issue is that during the welfare state period, the emphasis was on housing, as we know, and as it was badly rejected as all the problems of modernism. But the abandonment of public housing during this new liberal period has led to what we have now in the UK and many places, a housing crisis. But this period, the shift of attention is on public space instead of public housing. And what you see is it an easy way out? Is it an easy way out for the public authority to just pay attention to spend a bit of money, much less money, on the public environment, which is much more visible than the huge monies that they had to invest on public space, public housing provision? But this is the situation as well, that there is a crisis of public funding, and the bottom right is from the crisis of public parks in the UK. That there is not much money to run them, and there is 60% reduction in the budget, and that is causing serious problem. We can promote and advocate public space as much as we like, but if there's no one to look after it, if there's no one to invest in it, what is the situation? The first time I heard that in some countries you have to pay to go to a park was amazing to me. But it may be that we go that way. And I examined another PhD in Sweden, which was about how that generous public space that was provided in public housing schemes is now obviously cut into pieces and given to people to run it, to manage it, because there's no public management of those spaces anymore as such. And the other is that in this balance of power in public-private relations, you see more space given to the private sector. And that's the example of Liverpool, which is a big chunk of the city center is taken over by a private developer. Many streets are large for 250 years, which is very unusual, I have to say. So what we have is a situation where we move from a critique to an orthodoxy, from a situation where it was raised as a critique of neoliberalism to a situation now which is co-opted, adopted, used by this new system of... Now, you can see historically, when an idea comes about, success in a market economy means adoption by the market. But at the same time, when what it wants to happen is converting ideas and practices and objects into commodities that have monetary value in the market. So what happens is a transfer. The rhetoric may remain, the content changes in character, in the same way that the authorities change their character. So we have a public space that is no longer a place of interaction as such that was thought in all that lofty rhetoric of public space, but it becomes a place of attraction. And that is the example from Newcastle Centre, that this is run by the Business Improvement District, and obviously they want to attract people, and the attraction includes this object here. But by that, I also by reference to modernism, I meant to say that modernism was emerged as a critique. If you remember the title of Le Corbusier's book, Architecture or Revolution, that meant if you come up with architectural solutions to problems of society, you can solve those problems. Otherwise, we'll have revolution on our hands. But modernism was co-opted by the market after the Second World War, and you know what happened to it. And of course, then what happens when it's co-opted by the market? It becomes a tool of real estate value and gentrification, as in this case is a scheme for South London to develop. And they're all sold on the back of high-quality, good-looking public spaces. And this is the third item, third topic of multiplicity. By that, I really mean also, I was looking for a word that captures multiplicity as well as verticality or hierarchically organized society. Part of that, in this picture, I very much like this picture. In 2013, they had a Biennale of Democracy in Turin, and they set up all these installations and places for public debate, but it's a coincidence that she is inviting people to debate, but no one's worried much about it. But what we see is that in our discourse of public space, we are making these presumptions of universality and homogeneity, which is embedded and inherent in the idea of nation-state, presumption of unity and equality, which is inherent in the idea of democracy and democratic society, and the presumption of emptiness, which means it's a place that everybody can come into. It's not anybody's particular place, it's everybody's place. So it remains empty as a place that can be taken over by everyone, but not permanently, temporarily. All of these are assumptions. But the conditions we implement these ideas or don't are the conditions of inequality. hierarchical society, inequality, patriarchy, diversity, increasing diversity. And what happens is that publics are formed often, stronger publics are formed at the top of these hierarchies. And what you have is the lower ranks of those hierarchies where the possibility of formation of publics is weakened or doesn't happen, doesn't exist. And it leads to situations that are reflective of that gap between the rhetoric and the reality. These are cases that I want to show you. This is a case, one of my PhD students is working on this. It is near the port of Dover in England, and this is the North Sea. And she's researching the publicness of the sea and whether the developments that happen on the edge of the sea or inside the sea, the impact of that on the notion of the publicness of the sea and whether the sea can be considered a public space. And what you see here is the conflict, because the port of Dover wants to expand and it's extracting material from this area for construction. But this is an area with all these are shipwrecks, the history, there's a big history here, and also all sorts of environmental concerns for this dragging stuff out of the sea and using in construction of the port. What we have is a conflict of different meanings of the public. We have a port authority that claims that it is a national interest, that we are building it as cheaply as possible for a port that serves a nation, and the locals who say, look, this is heritage, this is environment, this is our life, that you are changing without knowing what the consequences are. So we have a clash of interests and clash of publics. Which side of the public are we talking about? Which interest of the public are we thinking to serve? And the question of unequal distribution, that is really, because we have a hierarchical society, therefore what happens is that even in Vienna, which is a very highly equal city at least, and very, still policies of housing subsidy, the sort of thing that could not be imagined in the UK anymore, very highly social democratic for many, many years. But even there, they had a strategy of public space improvement, many around the city. But in practice, it was implemented in the primary locations, in the display areas of the city, and not equally spread everywhere. So, I like this slide to show, and I took it in a first Biennale the first Biennale of public space in Rome. And this was somebody put it on the wall, that is the relationship between the public space and the private space. And that's the picture that they saw, and that's, they're asking why. Now, on the left, I summarize what I have said so far, and I'm not going to repeat it. So on the right, now I'm raising some questions. And those questions, one is, has the public space taken away attention from public services like housing and other services? Is it an easy way out? Is it something that you can show easily to be done? Another question is, has it been really enriching the local society's conditions of life, or is it really supporting the development value? Because when we talk about value of public space, and there is a lot of discussion about how you justify investment in, and that's in itself very interesting. It's highly controversial, but it's now so normalized to ask, why should we invest in public environment? Which you should be taken for granted that it's a good thing, it's a necessary thing. But when they say that, they justify it often on the basis of its contribution to real estate value. And of course, real estate value is not equally spread. It serves all people who are close to it or develop it. So, and then the question is another, has it become an instrument of globalized consumerism, which is driving the agenda of many cities? Go around this city. I went around yesterday evening, and it seems like the city of Reykjavik is becoming a center of, I feel like, a place of souvenirs and tourists. And it's very difficult to see where the life of this city happens. And therefore, and in my hotel has an information about the local neighborhood, and very unproblematically talks about the gentrification of the local neighborhood. So has it been hijacked by what it was a campaign against? And are our presuppositions tenable or not? Now, it may look very negative so far, and I don't want to end on a negative note. So what I do, this is my last slide, I try to end on a more positive note. This is a quotation and a reference to Octavia Hill. Octavia Hill was a social reformer of the Victorian age, and she's the founder of the National Trust, which is a very major organization in the UK. What she says, she was arguing, she was giving a lecture to a group of well-off people, and she was asking for provision of small open spaces as public gardens, opening the cemeteries, churchyards to the public, private squares, opening these because she says people need space, people need public space. Now this is in the late 19th century. So what I'm showing this is not to say we've gone back to the 19th century, but to say this is, of course, a social necessity. It is, of course, a critical, a very important critique of narrow interests and a democratic demand, which is good to pursue. But it's not a final destination. It's not something that we can reach. It's not a final product. It's a continuing demand. It's a continuing struggle to make sure that it happens. And it needs continuous work on making spaces that are open, inclusive, and accessible. And so it's not to say, we've lost the game, but it is a continuing process. Thank you.